All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Now It's Dark movie podcast. This is me, Tim.
And this is me, Mike. Welcome back, Tim.
Today's topic is one we've been talking about for a while. I think this is one of the first ideas we discussed. And I think it's one that if you are a commenter on films, if you're involved in analyzing or talking about movies, you kind of have to talk about it. It's inevitable that this will come up because it just looms as one of the monuments of film, as one of the most analyzable films ever made.
And still one of the most talked about, 1958's Vertigo, which was released May 9th, 1958.
I think one of the foremost interpretations or forms of analysis that have been made of this film have been kind of dominated by psychoanalysis. If you look at kind of like a landmark essay that mentions Vertigo, Laura Mulvey wrote Visual Pleasure Narrative Cinema, where she kind of focuses on Sigmund Freud and his writings on scopophilia, which is the idea of taking other people as objects, objectifying people, and subjecting them to a controlling and curious gaze, to quote her. Basically this idea of particularly a male gaze, controlling women, the idea that people get pleasure from watching, but also the idea that watching itself shapes other people's behavior, and that women themselves become objects, for a male gaze, that they start to shape their appearance and behavior to fit this ideal. And Vertigo in particular, she mentions, is kind of a textbook lesson in subjective camera as representative of the male gaze. I mean, in her analysis, the camera comes to be, identified with Scottie's looking at Madeline. And the viewer, the spectator, kind of narcissistically starts to identify with Scottie.
Well, yeah, it is Scottie's story, ultimately. It's not Judy's story. And even though he is kind of a creep and a weirdo at times because, he's just so obsessed with Madeline, he cares for Judy just because she reminds him of Madeline.
Right.
And so...
And he alters her appearance to...
And that's what I mean. He's a creep and a weirdo, and yet he is still the protagonist of this movie. And he is still the character that we sympathize with as the audience. And
this kind of fits into her analysis as well. She kind of mentions Scottie's sadistic voyeurism, where he's not only watching in the first half of the film, but he intervenes and alters sadistically Judy's appearance. But as the film progresses, she argues that the spectator kind of becomes complicit and exposed as complicit in this kind of act of looking. I think my critique of what she says is that in many ways, Scottie is such a perverse character that it's hard to imagine, particularly audiences in 1958, relating to him. I mean, as we already mentioned, he's kind of a failure, right?
Yeah.
Like he starts off, not being able to make this jump. He's reduced to wearing a corset in the next scene.
Yeah, that's right.
And he has a cane.
Yeah.
He's constantly kind of in this position of weakness.
Yeah. He can't protect the woman that he loves.
No.
Yeah.
No.
He's helpless.
He's responsible, one might argue, for the policeman's death at the beginning. He's responsible, or at least culpable in some respects, in Madeline's death. And then he's, responsible in some ways for Judy's death at the end. He's also constantly trying to conform himself to an image of masculinity that it's clear he's not capable of.
I see. I mean, that's, that it could be why he is self-conscious or even embarrassed about the corset.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think both Elster and a bookshop owner that Scottie goes to talk to both kind of mention this vision of the past, of San Francisco in the past where, things were different then and men could do things and get away with them. Men had money and freedom and power, I believe is the quote. And, they seem to be, at least Elster is someone prepared to kind of make that leap and become that masculine ideal.
Yeah.
Whereas Scottie is just lost,
Scottie couldn't be that man if he tried, though.
Right.
He just couldn't be. It's just not in him.
I think one of the reasons it's not in him is because he's hopelessly perverse. Mulvey kind of mentions this, but I don't think she really explores the full consequences of this because, 1958 is not exactly a time where perversion is celebrated. No,
it's not. And, you could maybe even see why that might have frustrated critics and that might have frustrated audience viewers at the time, if that all they wanted was some kind of, Jimmy Stewart, Alfred Hitchcock murder mystery or some sort of Jimmy Stewart adventure movie, that could be one of the reasons why this movie was frustrating to critics and audiences alike, is that it was just a perverted Jimmy Stewart running around being weird and weak.
Well, yeah, a hero that you're used to seeing as a likable character.
Yeah.
But also just think about the assumption of Elster enlisting Scottie in his plan.
Yeah.
He assumes, and rightly assumes, that Scottie will have no compunction about sleeping with his wife.
Yeah,
That's
right.
Think about what that implies for who Scottie was.
Yeah. He's got a reputation for it.
Right.
Yeah.
He's also single, in his kind of old age, or middle age at least.
Yeah.
And Stewart himself was aware of this. I found a quote where he says, it just wasn't my kind of part. My kind of guy is an easygoing, bumbling sort of fellow like the ones in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington or Rear Window.
Yeah, or, It's a Wonderful Life or something.
Right.
Yeah.
And this was really against cast. And I mean, when you see him, particularly in the scenes where Madeline is trying on, or Judy, sorry, is trying on clothes to kind of start to resemble Madeline when she's getting her hair done, Jimmy Stewart has this really, like, disturbing form of obsession.
Yeah,
he keeps saying, like, do this for me. Do this for me, Judy.
Yeah, and like the suits aren't quite right, just to the very last detail. Like it's a perfect color, but maybe it's just like the hem's just a little bit too high or something. And that might not be an actual critique he has against the dress, but it's these tiny little minute details that he has a real problem with. And he's not going to stop until he finds the exact same dress.
Right. I mean, he becomes very obviously disturbing and disturbed.
Yeah.
It can only alienate audiences. I mean, even to this day. It's also worth mentioning, too, that, like, we're supposedly complicit in, the male gaze directed at Judy to kind of reshape her into this ideal, to sadistically alter her.
Yeah.
But, I mean, think about the flashback that happens about 2/3 of the way through the film.
Oh, the one that Judy is imagining, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, we're let in as an audience member in the plot against Scottie.
Yeah, and Scottie's not aware of it.
Right. And if we are kind of complicit in Scottie's sadistic voyeurism directed against Judy, we're certainly just as complicit against Scottie in Elster's plot and to some degree Judy's plot against him as well. That's what complicates the film and complicates that interpretation. I mean, it's not simply just a male gaze against a passive recipient of that gaze.
Yeah.
There's a lot more going on.
Yeah. I think as the movie progresses, trauma becomes a big thing. He gets a little bit more unhinged, and I think as a result, that he kind of gets a little bit more unlikable as the movie goes on and on. The way that Scottie is that he's just in an endless cycle of trauma. He goes from trauma to recovery to relapse. That's how the movie opens, with a cop falling to his death and his vertigo really striking for the first time. And then it happens again midway through the movie when Madeline dies, right? The vertigo gets in the way again and she falls to her death. He has to recover again, and then the movie ends the exact same way, right?
Presumably with him at the start of another cycle.
Yes, the movie is just nothing but endless cycles of trauma for Scottie, and I think, of course, that's going to play with your mind in terrible ways. And I think after the second time that it happens in the movie, I think that's when you kind of start to see the really, really perverse Scottie in play, right? And so that's definitely going to mess with your mind.
When it's hard as an audience member to identify with someone who suffered so much trauma. I mean, what's interesting about the film and what complicates it as well is because Madeline, you presume, is also suffering the trauma, the past trauma of her great-grandmother having killed herself. Yeah. When she proves to not be actually Madeline, when it turns out that Judy is Madeline, you also have to presume that Judy is suffering the trauma of having, tricked this person she loves. Yeah. And caused him to become insane. Yeah. And now she's lying to him. There's endless trauma here that these characters are being motivated by.
And she seems, it kind of looks like she accidentally gets caught, but deep down, I think Judy really does want to get caught. I think she wants to stop lying to Scottie.
Well, there's a possibility there, for sure.
That's my interpretation. I think she does. I mean, it's an accident that she gets busted, but I think deep down it's almost a relief for her.
The obsessive nature of their love and the traumatic element of their love is something that Slavoj Zizek has really gotten into in a really powerful way. He kind of talks about how Scottie's ideal of Madeline, this ideal of like a fatal beauty, is really a stand-in for death. The more obsessed he becomes over Madeline, the more Scottie tries to discover, what this ideal is, the more he realizes that there's nothing really there. It's kind of an abyss. Well, think about the spiral motifs in the film.
Yeah.
The swirl in Madeline's hair, the staircase in the bell tower.
Yeah, that's a spiral that they're actually climbing up.
Right.
Yeah.
The descending landscape of San Francisco itself. Like everything seems to be kind of pointing towards this downward spiral. And what's at the bottom of this spiral? A void, a nothingness, an abyss.
The San Francisco Bay.
Right.
Yeah.
If this is indeed, what's behind the veil of Madeline's apparent beauty, then I think Zizek really has a point. And to go even further, as Zizek does, I mean, by attempting to realize this fantasy, Scottie has to, brutally alter Madeline's, Judy's appearance. There's almost like a mortification that seems to go on here. As Zizek mentions, like, there is a name for a fantasy realized. If you actually, fully and violently try to actualize this fantasy in your mind, there's a name for it. It's a nightmare.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the only way this can exist.
Well, I really like this analogy of Madeline being death, because the more that Scottie goes after Madeline, the more death finds him, and the more that he finds death, right? I mean, he pursues her twice, and both times she ends up dead. And both times he's losing pieces of himself as well, right? Because it's especially after the Madeline's first death where he actually has to go to the sanitarium and he's completely incapable of speaking, even when Midge shows up.
Right.
He's incapable of speaking. There is a piece of Scottie that has died along with Madeline, and he's never the same after that. And so, again, he meets Judy, and she dies again. And so there is nothing but death with
the more he
Madeline
pursues this ideal.
Yeah, the more that he pursues this idea and this ideal, there's only death and trauma.
And I think Hitchcock himself kind of confirms this analysis.
The sex psychological side is that you have a man creating a sex image
une image de sexe
that he can't go to bed with her
avec laquelle il ne peut pas coucher
until he's got her back.
Jusqu'à ce qu'il l'a de retour.
So the thing he wants to go to bed with.
À la chose avec laquelle il veut coucher.
Or, metaphorically,
ou métaphoriquement,
indulged in a form of necrophilia.
Une forme de nécrophilie.
And I think Hitchcock was very aware that behind the veil of this ideal of beauty, of fatal beauty, was nothing but death. And I think, Zizek's analysis does hold a lot of weight, but I think there's more to it. There are a lot of mysteries that the film has that psychoanalysis doesn't quite get at.
Yeah.
I mean, for one, all these interpretations kind of have to focus on Scottie's psychology. Both of these interpretations seem to assume that, the subjective camera is the most important element of this film, that the viewpoint of the film is Scottie's viewpoint. But I mean, if you look beyond that, there's a lot of parts of the film where it's not from Scottie's viewpoint.
Right. I mean, yeah, like Judy does get her own point of view at some point, like with the flashback, for instance.
Sure.
I mean, we are left alone in the room with Judy's own thoughts.
Also Midge.
Yeah, Midge as well. Yeah.
After Scottie kind of rejects her, there's this moment where she's standing with her painting, and she's like, "Oh, you idiot!"
Yeah, right. And when she drives up to Scottie's house and she sees Judy leaving,
when she talks to the doctor, and when he's in the sanitarium.
That's right. That's kind of when the movie's about Midge, right there.
Right.
Yeah.
But even more so, I mean, think about the opening of the film. What's the first image we see in Vertigo? For a movie ostensibly about gazing, it's kind of odd for a movie to start on the mouth of a female.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because especially if you're hanging from a great height, it's the sense that you perceive with your eyes that gives you the fear, right?
Right.
So it is kind of odd that he really does start on a mouth for no reason, because the mouth really does nothing at the opening credits. It's the eye that you really remember, because when the music kind of climaxes, the eye really, really widens in terror and fear.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, too, that there is a woman that doesn't appear in the film. And I've looked into it. Nobody's quite sure exactly who this woman is.
Yeah.
Some people have speculated Patricia Hitchcock, Hitchcock's daughter.
Okay.
But I don't think it is.
Yeah.
Regardless, who is this woman and what is she looking at? that inspires this look of terror in her eyes. That's kind of an enduring mystery for me about this film.
Yeah, and I suppose maybe the simple answer could just be that it's just Hitchcock being cute, just being like, hey, it's another suspense movie, you're going to get scared. You know, that could just be the simple answer right there. It might not be the right one. Could just be the simple answer. It's just Hitchcock just kind of being cute.
Well, I think it points to the fact that there are conflicting points of view in the film.
Yeah.
That it's not just subjective. Consider when Scottie first sees Madeline.
Yeah.
Looking at that scene in particular, I mean, it's interesting how the camera keeps switching viewpoints. I mean, at a certain point, it's, Scottie's point of view, but then the camera kind of dollies out to the subjective point of view. And then when Scottie first sees Madeline, he's not looking at her, yet we see her profile. There are other moments in the film where, the camera really deviates from Scottie's point of view. I think in order to accommodate all these conflicting points of view, the camera kind of has to occupy this really weird space, which I would call kind of a pre-subjective space. If you've ever read like someone like Gilles Deleuze and people like that, like they talk about this kind of pre-subjective space, something that exists independently of people. It's a space of tension of both Scottie and Judy's point of view. It's almost opposites at once.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes the film so disturbing in some ways, is that it is going in these two different directions at once, that we're constantly being spiraled beneath the surface of things as identities start to break down, as people lose their sanity, as we start to question the reality of this film. It's an incredibly disturbing and unsettling sort of reality that this film exists in.
Yeah, and it goes right in hand with the city of San Francisco itself. It's a city that's just going up and down and up and down. We touched upon that a little bit as far as the spirals are concerned. But yeah, you're never really on flat, level ground in that city. Spectacular time talking with you today, Tim.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great discussion. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't. We don't put out a lot of podcasts, but we try to put a lot of time and effort into each one we put out. So hopefully you can start a discussion, and feel free to comment below as well.
That's right, yeah, especially if you have any suggestions or ideas of what you would like to hear us talk about next, we'd absolutely love to hear from you.